Hi everyone, I'm William Smith, a professional services engineer here at Jamp, and today we're going to talk about starting over. If you haven't heard, imaging is dead. But why? Why is Apple making this much more difficult than it used to be? It has to do with the integrity of the macOS. For the past few years, Apple has been implementing security measures to ensure the macOS and other software is free from tampering and corruption. You may have heard of the T2 chip, which shipped with the first iMac Pro, and then later with the Mac Mini, the MacBook Pro, and the MacBook Air. One of its duties is to ensure the lowest levels of the macOS aren't tampered with and that only trusted operating system software loads at startup. If the integrity of the macOS is compromised at boot, the Mac boots into macOS recovery and launches the boot recovery assistant. Since OS X El Capitan 10.11, we've had System Integrity Protection, or SIP, in place to prevent users and administrators from modifying the operating system and essential files. Catalina takes this a step further and partitions your hard drive into a read-only Macintosh HD with nothing but the macOS operating system itself, and then a writable Macintosh HD-data partition. That's for the applications that you add and your settings and your user data. The Finder takes care of making the two partitions appear as one. So if Apple is concerned about protecting its customers from a macOS that's been tampered with after it's installed, it only makes sense to be concerned about what happens at the time it's being installed. We're going to keep this webinar short and focused on reinstalling macOS Catalina. But keep in mind that much of what I'm showing you today is useful for upgrading an earlier macOS like High Sierra or Mojave to Catalina. So to start, we'll cover the startOS install command and how it works. We'll look at how to get the Catalina installer, including a new feature added to the software update command. We'll then put together a couple of workflows to install Catalina automatically as well as through self-service. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll provide a link to some resources around what we're covering. Before we begin, for those of you new to Jamp, here's a quick summary of what we do. Jamp helps organizations succeed with Apple. Jamp Now is for smaller organizations with basic MDM needs and requires no IT, whereas Jamp Pro is our more robust management solution for larger enterprise, education, and government customers. And with Jamp Connect, an end user can unbox their Mac, power it on, and access all of their corporate applications after signing on with a single set of Okta and Microsoft Azure credentials. Jamp helps more than 35,000 organizations to manage more than 15 million Apple devices, and we serve key markets such as the top tech companies, F500 companies, most valuable brands, the top marketing group, and over 14,000 schools. We're going to start today with the command startOS install. This is the tool that's going to take us from a Mac that's maybe running High Sierra or maybe Mojave or even Catalina and bring us back to the equivalent of a factory reset. We can automate it through Jamp Pro to reset entire lab environments or put it into self-service as a one-click button for technicians. All user data will be erased and your Mac will install a fresh Catalina OS. To find the command, I'm going to open a new Finder window and browse the Applications folder. In here, I'm going to select the macOS Catalina app and then right-click and choose Show Package Contents. And then inside Contents, I'll choose the Resources folder where I'm going to find the startOS install command line tool. So what do I do with this? It's a command line tool. I need terminal. So I'll press Command spacebar to open Spotlight and start typing terminal until I find it, and then I'll press Return to open it. Now I'm going to drag the startOS install command line tool into its window to fill out the full path to it. From here, I can add -- usage to get more information about how to use the StartOS install command. Each of these items is called an argument. These are options that we can set when calling StartOS install. So let's talk about some of these. When we double-click the macOS Catalina installer, one of the screens we see through is Apple's license agreement. When we run the StartOS install command, we see the same thing. If we run the command with the -- license argument, we see the entire license. However, we can suppress seeing the license by adding the -- agree to license argument. We need to do that to let our automation work. The reboot delay argument is useful when calling the StartOS install command with a script. If needed, we can delay the restart for up to 5 minutes to give us time to let other processes quit that might get in the way of restarting the computer. But generally, we're not going to need this one. In addition to installing Catalina, we might want to install one or more packages, maybe Jamp Pro's Quick Add package. Installing a Quick Add package would enroll a Mac into Jamp Pro while still at the Setup Assistant. Now, why would we want to do something like that? You might do it to create a placeholder record in Jamp Pro and make the computer record for the Mac ready for scoping, or you might do it to enable policies and profiles to install before handing the computer over to the end user. The end user can complete the Setup Assistant, but everything he or she needs would be in the place right away. This might also be useful for lab Macs in schools where you want provisioning to continue instead of waiting for a technician to proceed through the Setup Assistant on each machine. The erase and install argument is really, though, what makes the magic happen. Let's talk about what it does. Here I have a Mac laptop running High Sierra that's been in use for a few years, and it's really ready for a refresh. Over time, it's had applications installed and upgraded and removed, maybe leaving some unused pieces behind. And we've also added user accounts and their files and their preferences and their settings. We're ready to re-provision this Mac for someone else, but we want a clean Catalina OS installed. First, we have to get the macOS Catalina installer app on the Mac. We'll discuss ways to do that in just a bit. Then in Terminal or using Jamp Pro, we'll run the StartOS install command with the -- erase install argument, just like this. On the fly, the command takes some of the free space on the drive and it creates a new partition on the disk. Then it copies the Catalina installer over to make that partition bootable. The Mac restarts to the new volume, and then the second installer deletes and recreates the original partition. When that's done, the Catalina installer places a fresh macOS back onto the primary partition. Now it's updated to Catalina. It boots the Mac to the fresh Catalina install, and it removes the temporary partition. After about 20 to 30 minutes, our Mac is at the Setup Assistant, and it's ready for provisioning. Now that's how the erase install feature works. Along with it, we can include the -- new volume name argument to reset the hard drive name back to Macintosh HD if users have changed it to something else, or if we use a script, we could pull information like the serial number from the Mac and rename the drive to that. Finally, Catalina's StartOS install includes a new feature to force quit any running apps that may prevent the computer from rebooting. StartOS install is our command that we're going to be using for everything that we're doing today, and we'll find it inside the Install macOS Catalina app. When we run it to erase and install the operating system, we'll use the -- erase install argument, along with others like -- agree to license to avoid the license prompt, -- force quit apps to keep any running apps from preventing the restart, and -- new volume name to reset the name of our hard drive. Everything else we'll cover supports this command. Now let's talk about ways to get the Install macOS Catalina app and getting it ready for deployment. Remember, before we can use the Start OS install command, we must have the Catalina installer app on our Macs. We'll always find a link to the installer in the Mac App Store. When you click the Get button, it'll download into your Applications folder. To deploy it, you can open Composer and drag it into the left pane and build a package that you can upload to your distribution point. Add that to a policy in Jamp Pro, and it's ready for scoping. We'll also talk a little bit more about scoping in just a few minutes too. When you deploy your package to your Macs, the Catalina installer appears in their Applications folder just as if it had downloaded from the App Store there. Catalina, however, gives us a new option for getting the installer app using the software update command. This is the command line equivalent of the software update pane in System Preferences. It can do most everything you see here, plus some additional cool features. If I open Terminal and simply enter software update, one word, and press return, I get the usage page. Now you're going to see a long list of arguments that we can add to the software update command, but there's a couple of new ones that I'd like to point out. In Catalina, we can now have the option to fetch a full macOS installer. That's going to download the latest available version of macOS. Or if we add -- full installer version, we get the version of macOS that we specify. So to get the latest Catalina installer, I'll run the command sudo software update -- fetch full installer. Here's what it looks like in action. It's not very exciting, and I've dramatically sped up the time on this recording. It takes just as long to download the installer using this command as it does to download from the App Store or through the Software Update app. However, now we don't have to repackage it, and we don't have to then upload that package to our distribution point to deploy. Once it's done, we have a full installer in our Applications folder. And if instead I wanted to get the latest version of macOS Mojave, I'd add the -- full installer version option followed by 10.14.6, and that would download for me instead. Again, the ability to download the full installer using the command line is only available in Catalina. If you're trying to upgrade earlier systems like Mojave or High Sierra up to Catalina, you're going to have to download and repackage the Catalina installer first and push it out. Only on Catalina can you use the command line to download it. Now, here's a useful tip for those of you who may want to use the software update command on a room full of Macs, like a lab. Find the beefiest Mac you have in your room or on your network and open the sharing pane in System Preferences. Enable the content caching service there at the bottom. Now, optionally, if you have Jamp Pro 10.9 or later, you can deploy a configuration profile to turn on the caching service as well. Then restart one of your lab Macs to ensure it'll find the caching server immediately, and then run the software update command with the -- fetch full installer. Doing this a little ahead of time before you have to re-image the entire room warms the cache. It makes the 8 gig Catalina installer download to your network, where then it'll be served to the rest of your Macs from that point on. If you open the activity monitor on your caching server and select the Cache tab, you can see whether your content caching server is working. A content caching server will likely speed up your downloads for the rest of your lab Macs by 50% or more. Now, don't forget, if this isn't something that you would normally have on your network, be sure to turn off the content caching server after you're finished changing out your Macs. How do we know our Macs are ready to install Catalina? Apple has a knowledge base article that gives the specifics for us. So long as a Mac meets the minimum hardware requirements on the right, is running OS 10, 10.9 or later, has 4 gigs of memory and plenty of disk space, you can upgrade it to Catalina. Let's make a smart group in Jamp Pro to do this. Now in Jamp Pro, I'll navigate to Computers and Smart Computer Groups and click the New button. I've named my new smart group macOS Catalina Compatible Macs. Note that I'm naming it for exactly what it's going to contain, Macs that meet the general and hardware requirements for installing Catalina. I'm also going to include those that may already be running Catalina, and the reason for that is I might down the road want to reinstall Catalina on the same machine. If it's there ahead of time, I'll always be able to run my startOS install command on the fly. For my criteria, I'll start by adding the general requirements from Apple's knowledge base article. The operating system must be greater than or equal to 10.9. I must have at least 4 gigs of memory. And remember, 4,096 megabytes of memory equals 4 gigs, so my requirement is more than 4,095 megs. And I like to have plenty of disk space when installing an operating system. Although Apple only requires 12.5 gigs for El Capitan and higher, I'm doubling that to 25 gigs just to give me some breathing room. So what about the hardware requirements though? Apple's knowledge base listed minimum requirements for every Mac model, but to identify those Macs in Jamp Pro, we need to use the model identifier. That lets us pinpoint very specific Mac models. However, Catalina is compatible with nearly 60 unique Mac models. That's nearly 60 unique model identifiers. Could you imagine how long it would take to create a smart group like the one I'm showing you here? Probably a few hours. Jamp Pro 10.7 and higher supports using regular expressions, or regex for short. Instead of typing nearly 60 pieces of criteria into a smart group, we can replace all that with one regular expression like this that matches the model identifiers we need. Regular expressions are beyond what we're going to cover here today. If you're not familiar with how to create them, search Jamf Nation to see if someone may already have done that for you. I put this one together, and don't worry about trying to write it down or take a screenshot. I'm going to include it with my resources at the end of the webinar. In Jamf Pro, I'll add the model identifier criterion and set my operator to match as regex. Then I'll paste in my regular expression and save my smart group. Now, in addition to that smart group for identifying Catalina compatible Macs, I'm going to make one more. This one's going to identify all Macs where I already have the Install macOS Catalina app in the Applications folder. I don't need to download a copy to a Mac that already has it. My criteria here identifies the installer app by its name and identifies its version, so that later when Apple releases Catalina 10.15.1, 10.15.2, etc., I'll be able to update the app version here in my smart group, and then all of my Macs will retrieve the new installer automatically. Now, be sure to note the installer's app version number is slightly different from the macOS version number. If Catalina 10.15.0 is out today, its installer version is 15.0. And then 10.15.1 would have an installer version of 15.1. Now that we've made a smart group to identify Catalina compatible Macs and another one to identify Macs that already have the current Catalina installer, let's use them for scoping to policies. Here's where we put together everything discussed so far. The first thing we need to do is get the Install macOS Catalina app deployed to our target Macs. Then we need to either send the startOS install command to erase their drives and reinstall the operating system, or we can make it available in self-service. That's what I'm going to show you today. I'm looking at my list of policies, and here's my first policy to cache the macOS Catalina installer to my Macs. I've clicked the disclosure triangle on the left to give me this overview. This is a great overview that shows everything that I need to know about this policy. Now, this policy does two things. One, It runs the software update command to download the Catalina 10.15 installer, and 2, it updates inventory after that in order to keep Jamp up to date. If you look at the scope, you'll see that the policy is targeted to our smart group that identifies Catalina compatible Macs. We only want the installer to download onto Macs that meet Apple's hardware and disk space requirements. I'm using my second smart group, though, to exclude those Macs that already have the Catalina installer. This prevents Jamp Pro from needlessly downloading it again, but if someone deletes it, then Jamp Pro is just going to put it right back. I'm setting my trigger to run the policy the next time a Mac checks in, and I'm setting my frequency to just once per day. I'm in no hurry to get the installer downloaded. This is going to run silently, and it won't alert our users or interfere with anything that they're doing. So you can deploy the Catalina installer while somebody's using their computer, and they won't be the wiser. Now, if for some reason I can't use the software update command to download the installer, maybe I'm on Mojave, I can replace the command with the package I created earlier using Composer. All right, let's look at my second policy. This is the one that actually does the work of erasing and reinstalling macOS Catalina. All it does is run our startOS install command with the erase install, agreed to license, force quit apps, and new volume name arguments. I'm scoping it to our smart group that identifies only the Macs with Catalina installer present on the machine. There's no need to try to run the command if Catalina's not there. And I'm putting it into self-service so that either an end user or a technician can trigger the erase and install manually. Now, if you don't want your end users to see this particular policy in self-service, I suggest that you scope this only to your technicians as users and then require your technicians to log into self-service in order to be able to see the policy. Here's what I see in self-service. I'm trying to be very clear with the policy name and button to convey that this will erase the drive. Furthermore, I'm forcing the person clicking the button to read this message before proceeding. I've used a little bit of markdown to make warning bigger and bolder, and I've added a little more markdown in the text below to add some bolded text that emphasizes we should copy all the important files to another computer or backup system before proceeding. Once the user clicks the Erase and Install button, it takes just a few minutes for the startOS install to partition the drive, copy over the installer, and restart. Let's see what that looks like. I have my policy in self-service. When I click the policy name, I see my warning about saving user data. I click the Erase and Install button, and I wait. Now, fair warning, I have sped up this video so that we don't have to wait. In a few minutes, the Mac restarts, and about 10 minutes later, it's going to restart again, and I'm ready to proceed through the Setup Assistant. Now we're ready for DEP enrollment or anything else that you would like to do with this Mac. It is a clean reset with no user data, no settings. It does not even know about your network. Wouldn't it be nice if it were really that fast that we could do this in just a few seconds? Maybe someday. So that's my presentation for you today. I hope you found it useful. We covered the startOS install command that comes with macOS Catalina installer, and we covered ways to acquire the installer. To put this into Jamp Pro, we needed a couple of smart groups that identified our Macs, making sure that they meet Apple's general and hardware requirements, as well as those Macs with the installer already in place. Then we scoped those two policies to deploy the installer to Macs that needed it and put the startOS install command into self-service, and we ran it from there. All the code snippets and URLs that I've been using are here in the resources that I provided you at jampit/eraseinstall-webinar. Look for our blog post in a few days to follow up this webinar, and visit Jamp Nation discussions to chat with me and others about putting together workflows for reprovisioning your Macs. We're all here to help you succeed with Apple. And before we conclude, I'd like to say that Jamp also offers more to help you be successful. Our professional services offer on-location or remote services to customize Jamp Pro for your environment. That's what I do every day here at Jamp. We also offer certification courses led by our training team. You can become an expert in Jamp Pro and widen your skill sets. And then finally, we have world-class support from Apple experts across the globe. We even offer 24/7 support with our premium support packages. I appreciate you listening. If you registered for this webinar, you'll receive a link in a few days with a link to the video so you can watch this again. And again, you can find me at Talking Moose on jampnation.com. I appreciate you listening.